Throughout history, there have been people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes fathomable. For those crimes, they have been convicted and sentenced to death. Welcome to Death Row Executions, where we take a look into the lives of society's worst offenders. And now, your host, Air.
The Massey family, living in a small town in Virginia, was supposed to be celebrating the Christmas holiday in joy and harmony. But for young Robert Lee Massey, born on December 24, 1941, this day marked the beginning of a tumultuous life. His mother, only 15 years old at the time, wed a much older man to avoid his jail sentence. Robert's mother had no say in the matter, which resulted in her and her son experiencing physical assaults from him. Robert's childhood was filled with fear and turmoil as he constantly lived under the threat of violence from his father. At times, he would even be held underwater by his father as well. Feeling alone and helpless, Robert ran away from home when he was just in elementary school. His parents lost custody of him, and although never adopted by a new family, he bounced from foster home to foster home. The foster families he was with were guilty of assaulting him just like his biological father did, which is why he kept switching to new families. Finally, Robert had enough, and he ran away when he was just 11 years old and refused to go to school. He was quickly caught and sent to Beaumont School, a place for truant and runaway boys. Unlike today's society where teachers must tread carefully around children's emotions, during Robert's time at Beaumont School, physical punishment was the norm for disobedience. As a result of his behavior and attitude, Robert often found himself receiving personal time with a leather belt at the hands of staff members. Despite his young age, Robert already felt conflicted about authority figures and their methods of discipline. He never returned to regular school and decided to live his life as a criminal. Skipping ahead to 1958, Robert was now 17 years old and living the street life. He was caught stealing a car and sent to prison for the first time. As a new, young inmate, he quickly became a target for the perverted prisoners who had no contact with the outside world in years. They saw him as fresh meat and took advantage of his youthful appearance. One day, 4 men cornered Robert in his cell and took turns assaulting him sexually. Realizing that he was no match for his attackers and unable to defend himself, he began acting like he was crazy. Eventually, the prison intervened and he was transferred to a psychiatric facility to complete his sentence. After serving the rest of his sentence at a psychiatric facility, and despite knowing he would not survive in prison, Robert continued committing crimes. On January 7, 1965, when Robert was 23 years old, he decided not to earn money the honest way by getting a job. Instead, he chose to go on a crime spree, robbing people. Robert's crime spree started on January 7, 1965, and lasted up until January 20, 1965. On the evening of January 7, 1965, the first crime Robert committed that night was when he made his way to West Covina, California, armed with a rifle. Robert noticed a man getting out of his car that was parked in front of his home, and Robert walked up to him, popped him in the mouth, and ordered him to give him all of his money. The man followed Robert's commands and gave him his wallet. Not wanting to leave him as a witness, Robert shot his rifle at him and fled the scene. Thankfully, the bullet grazed the victim's head, and unbeknownst to Robert, he survived. Not satisfied with the amount of money that was in his first victim's wallet, Robert set out to rob more people. He was successful robbing some people, and for others, he failed to get any money. Robert most likely made his way to San Gabriel from West Covina, which is a city about 13 miles away by car on the 10 West Freeway. In San Gabriel, he was in a residential area and noticed an older couple returning to their home after spending time away from their house. The couple was Morris and Mildred Weiss. Morris and Mildred were in their car and got out so they could go inside of their home. That's when Robert walked up to them and fatally shot them after a botched robbery. Mildred was a mother of 2, and her 18-year-old son, Ron Weiss, heard the gunshots and with his adrenaline running, chased Robert down. Unfortunately, Ron Weiss was unable to catch Robert because Robert made it inside of his getaway car parked down the street and escaped. Robert was able to avoid jail time for the time being and continued on with his crime spree after killing Mildred. On January 15th, a week after he killed Mildred, and about 14 miles away from San Gabriel, Robert made his way to MacArthur Park in Los Angeles. While there, Robert met a man by the name of Frank Patty. It is unclear and undocumented as to why the men met up and what they were conversing about. It could be that the two had an attraction for one another, or drugs were involved. Whatever the case may be, Frank allowed Robert to come back to his hotel room. Once the men were both inside of Frank's hotel room, Robert took out a revolver and demanded that Frank give him all of his money. As he was demanding for money, Robert also demanded Frank to take off all of his clothes. That was too much for Frank, and he refused. He was okay with giving up all of his money, but not letting Robert see him in such a vulnerable state. Angered, Robert shot at Frank 3 times with his revolver. 2 shots hit Frank in the stomach, and 1 shot nicked his neck. Robert didn't stay to see if Frank survived or not, because after firing the 3 rounds, he fled the hotel room. Frank survived, but Robert was still on the run. Not only for this crime, but for killing Mildred while in the process of committing a robbery just a week before. Robert was free for another 5 days, and on January 20th, 1965, authorities finally caught up with him. Investigators questioned him only about his attack against Frank Patty, though. While Robert was being interrogated, he admitted to authorities that not only did he shoot Frank, but he was the one who was responsible for killing Mildred Weiss and for committing robberies throughout Los Angeles. With that confession, Robert was charged for murder, attempted murder, and 4 counts of theft. Robert stood trial after pleading guilty to all charges, and he was found guilty of all charges. When the jury came back with a sentence, they believed Robert should face the death penalty. The judge upheld the decision, and Robert was sent to California's death row at San Quentin Prison. Unlike death row inmates today in California who sit on death row for years and will most likely not be executed until a governor of California is for executions, like past Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, Robert was on death row for 2 years before he was scheduled to die. It was 1967, and the governor of California at the time was Ronald Reagan. Before Ronald Reagan became a United States president and took office in January of 1981, he was the governor of California from 1967 to 1975. The same year he became governor of California, he made the decision to personally grant Robert Massey a stay of execution just so that he could testify at the trial of his crime spree accomplice. Apparently, Robert was working with a partner in crime. After testifying, Robert remained on California's death row with no scheduled date for an execution. But in 1972, the fate of all death row inmates across America would change. William Henry Furman, along with 2 other individuals, were convicted of heinous crimes and sentenced to death. William Furman and one of his co-defendants was deemed mentally challenged. They appealed their sentences, arguing that the death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment, which is prohibited by the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and even though their crimes were cruel and unusual, they should be given a reprieve. In William Furman's case against the state, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with the appeal, and they found that the way the death penalty was being applied was arbitrary and discriminatory, often affecting minorities and the poor more than others. This led to the temporary ban on the death penalty. This affected all death row inmates, and across America, over 600 inmates who were sentenced to death were resentenced to life in prison. Robert Lee Massey was one of those inmates, and he was now in prison serving a life sentence. Not life without the possibility of parole, though. Life with the possibility of parole. In California, an inmate can be given either life sentences, but if the inmate is sentenced to life with parole, it does not mean they will spend the rest of their life in prison. Most inmates are in prison for a minimum of 7 years before they are released from prison on parole. While Robert was in prison, the death penalty was reinstated in 1976 after states revised their criminal statutes to ensure it was not applied arbitrarily or discriminatory. 6 years had passed, and Robert was still sitting in a California prison. In 1978, they released him on parole for being a model prisoner. Robert went from a death row inmate to a prisoner serving life to being a free man after serving a total of 13 years in prison for first-degree murder. Mildred Weiss's son, Ron Weiss, was hoping to witness Robert's execution, but he now believed that day would never come. Instead of going back to Southern California, Robert stayed in Northern California, San Francisco to be exact. Being a model prisoner in prison was easier than being a model citizen in the real world. On the streets of San Francisco, Robert continued on with his criminal lifestyle. On January 3, 1979, Robert walked into a liquor store. 61-year-old liquor store owner Boris Naumov was there, and Robert robbed him. There was one customer inside of the store, but he was unaware that Robert was robbing Boris. Another customer walked in the store and stood right next to Robert. Boris handed Robert money. Robert placed the money in his pocket and casually walked away. Boris then said out loud, A guy can't make a living anymore." Right before Robert was going to walk out, Boris made the decision to chase after Robert and retrieve the money he gave him. There was a struggle, and both men were in the middle of an aisle wrestling each other. Robert was able to overpower the older store owner, and in typical Robert Massey fashion, he fired his gun a few times, and one bullet hit Boris in the neck, instantly killing him. Another stray bullet hit the store employee that had walked in, but it was not fatal. The employee was shot in the right thigh. Robert was able to casually flee the scene while all of the witnesses were too scared to move or intervene. Robert wasn't able to evade authorities for long, though. Police immediately put a bolo out on Robert. Finally, at around 10 p.m., the night after he shot and killed Boris, Robert was found and apprehended by police. When authorities searched him, they found that he was in possession of multiple weapons and had a large amount of ammunition. Robert cooperated, and he was arrested without incident. He was then transported to the San Francisco Hall of Justice, and just like he did the first time he was sentenced to death, Robert admitted to all of his crimes. He admitted to attempting to rob a liquor store and pulling the gun on the owner, but only because the owner attacked him when he was trying to leave. Robert then claimed that it wasn't entirely his fault because he was under the influence. He was drunk and took a bunch of cocaine right before he walked into the liquor store and killed Boris. Robert was charged with first-degree murder because he was committing robbery in the course of the murder. Robert was represented by lawyers, and his lawyers encouraged him to plead not guilty, but Robert believed there was nothing to hide and went against his lawyers' wishes and pled guilty. It was a speedy trial, and less than 5 months after he killed Boris, Robert was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin Prison in California to sit on death row. Soon after he was sent to San Quentin, there was an automatic appeal to the Supreme Court of California, and the court found that Robert should not have been allowed to plead guilty against the advice of his lawyer. Because of this, Robert's death sentence was overturned and a new trial was ordered. According to court documents, on July 9, 1979, Robert filed this petition in the district court. Relying on a Sixth Amendment guarantee of self-representation, Robert contended that an automatic, unwaivable appeal of his death conviction constitutes cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment and deprives him of due process of law. Robert stressed that he was not challenging the validity of the California automatic appeal statute per se, but only as applied to him individually against his wishes. At the September 21, 1979 district court hearing on his habeas petition, Robert was not allowed to be present, nor was he represented by counsel. The federal public defender had been appointed to represent him, but had been allowed to withdraw because he could not ethically present Robert's arguments. Robert's petition was dismissed by the district court on October 3, 1979, on the grounds that Robert, the petitioner, had failed to establish a violation of his constitutional rights. Robert had not shown that his incarceration by the state during the period necessary to determine his automatic appeal was cruel and unusual punishment. His new trial came, where he was now pleading not guilty, despite admitting to all of his crimes. A jury found him guilty of all charges, and he was once again sentenced to death. While on death row, Robert was okay with death, but there were still automatic appeals with the Supreme Court of California upholding the death sentence. Robert argued that there is and was a meaningful difference between forcing an automatic appeal upon a defendant and forcing unwanted counsel upon him. The state asserted, however, that while a litigant may waive the advantage of a law intended solely for his benefit, he may not waive a law established for a public reason. The California courts upheld that a defendant sentenced to death may not waive the automatic appeal provisions. Being that Robert had been sentenced to death for murdering Mildred back in the 60s, Robert had now been on death row for almost 30 years. When it was nearing his March 27, 2001 execution, Robert had been on death row for 21 years and 10 months and was known as the Dean of Death Row. Robert welcomed death, though, and took part in interviews where he said he wanted to give up all of his appeals because he wanted to protest the snail pace of the California death penalty system. Robert did not want to be represented by anyone, but that did not stop capital punishment opponents from hiring lawyers for him. Robert was quoted saying, "I don't see a use in continuing this charade." In a phone interview, Robert said, "Convicted killers should be allowed to stop all appeals. I'm tired. I just don't want to live the rest of my life in jail." On March 14, 2001, Robert penned a letter to the public. "Fixin' a die. Let my death give life to a challenge of California's machinery of execution," by Robert Lee Massey. Soon I will be dead. Early on the morning of March 27th, the state of California will flood my veins with a lethal cocktail of sodium pentothal, pancuronium bromide, and potassium chloride. Death will follow swiftly. I could live for several more years. I voluntarily abandoned federal appellate review of California's judgment of death. Many have labeled this suicide. It is not. I did not ask the district attorney to charge my case as a capital crime. I did not persuade a jury to recommend the death penalty. I did not ask the trial judge to impose the death penalty. I will not push the plunger that injects poison into my bloodstream. These are acts of the state of California on behalf of you, the people. It is preposterous to call my death at the hands of the state, whether now or later, an act of suicide. Even if I were to win on appeal, I would never again see the outside of a prison. I have lived in prison most of my adult years, nearly 30 on death row. I am a rational man. I do not consider foregoing the raptures of another decade behind bars to be an irrational decision. I knew my decision would draw attention to my case, and it has. I have something to say, and I want Californians to hear it. In your name, judges are violating their oaths to uphold the Constitution. They are disregarding their obligations to the rule of law in service of a process, the intricate machinery of extermination, constructed by the legislature and legitimized by the courts, which exists for the sole purpose of producing a constitutionally airtight death sentence. Take my case. When I came up for trial in 1979, my state-appointed lawyer tried to prevent me from pleading guilty. When he failed and I was sentenced to death, another state-appointed lawyer appealed my conviction to the state Supreme Court against my wishes. The Rosebud Court reversed my conviction because my state-appointed lawyer didn't agree with my guilty plea. It sent the case back for a retrial that I never asked for and didn't want. The second trial should have been barred by the Double Jeopardy Clause because a defendant cannot be tried twice for the same crime unless he, not the state, appeals. In my case, it was the state's appeal, taken against my wishes, that led to the second trial, but I was again tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. The court considered and rejected arguments I never wanted to make because they would have resulted in yet another trial that I didn't want, to make the decision appear to meet constitutional requirements. It affirmed my conviction on such blatant grounds that the court's opinion can only be viewed as a deliberate effort to skirt the Constitution. This was a transparent violation of each justice's oath to uphold the Constitution, and my execution will therefore be unconstitutional. I have devoted more than a decade to studying the law in capital cases. Many men on death row have asked me to help them evaluate the work of their state-appointed attorneys, purportedly on their behalf. Time and time again, I have seen solid constitutional arguments superficially asserted, if at all, and buried under a mountain of frivolous arguments that have no chance of winning. This allows courts to write lengthy opinions rejecting issue after issue without ever coming to grips with the serious constitutional issues which should have been the heart of the case. Death penalty litigation is the state's process from beginning to end. State prosecutors, state agency lawyers appointed to represent defendants, geared toward one inevitable result, and a court whose complicity constitutes a repudiation of the justice's obligation to honor the Constitution. I hope my death will give life to a challenge to California's machinery of death, not simply because I got a raw deal, but because I see dishonesty and incompetence leading to unnecessary death all around me every day. The state's need for a well-oiled machine has assumed a position of superiority over the constitutional rights of defendants. The machine must be dismantled and replaced with attorneys who truly represent their clients and judges who enforce and uphold the Constitution. When it was time for Robert's execution, he had a last meal of 2 vanilla milkshakes, extra crispy French fries, extra crispy fried oysters, and soft drinks. Ron Weiss, son of Robert's victim Mildred Weiss, thought he would never get the chance to see Robert executed, but he was hoping his whole life he would be able to do so. He was sad that his father had died of natural causes and would not be able to do the same. Many witnesses wanted to be present during the execution, but prison spokesperson Russ Heinrich said the prison filed a lawsuit to prevent a lot of witnesses because they wanted to protect the staff as much as they could. The case was heard, and the judge did not rule in favor of the prison. The judge said, "The public has a keen interest in witnessing the manner by which government wields its most devastating power, the power lawfully to take a life. Whatever one's views on the death penalty, it should not be carried out behind closed doors. Initially, the prison imposed limits of witnesses after California changed its execution method from gas to lethal injection. They told the court that because the method of execution was now lethal injection, it would require guards to be in the chamber for a longer period of time, and in the past, curtains were closed, and reporters had to rely on official descriptions of events that took place while the curtain was closed. U.S. District Judge Von Walker ruled back in 1996 that the restrictions were unconstitutional, and his ruling stayed in effect. The court said that Judge Walker had given too much weight to the media's access rights and not enough to guard safety. Judge Walker said that part of the viewing restrictions were because the prison feared bad publicity. Now, Judge Walker's new ruling said the state had failed to show that allowing witnesses to see the process from start to finish would endanger guards who volunteer for the execution team. He noted that no California guard had ever been harmed or threatened for taking part in an execution, and that the guards could wear surgical masks to conceal their identities. With that, on March 27, 2001, a little after midnight, Robert was escorted in the execution chamber by 5 guards who placed him on a gurney and strapped him in. As for their identities, the guards took off their badges, but other than that, they did nothing to prevent the 50 witnesses there to view the execution. Robert pumped his fist, and he was ready to go. His last words were, "Forgiveness," giving up all hope for a better past. Out of the 50 witnesses, the only ones there in support of Robert was his attorney, Frederick Baker, and 2 spiritual advisors. When the drugs were administered, Robert made eye contact with Frederick after the guards turned the gurney for Robert so that he could face him. Robert died at 12:33 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on a Tuesday at the San Quentin prison. At the time of his death, he had been the inmate who was on California's death row the longest. Along with Ron Weiss witnessing Robert's execution, Boris Naumov's son, Rick Naumov, sat near Ron during the execution. After the execution, Rick was quoted saying, "The hurt for my family will never stop. We continue to deal with the loss of a husband, a father, and a grandfather." Ron Weiss was happy that justice was served. Thank you all for watching another episode of Death Row Executions. Let me know what you guys think of the story in the comments below.